Okay, great. Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this People's and Workers' Assembly of the Climate Justice Charter Movement. My name is Vishwas Satka. I'm a co-chair of the Climate Justice Charter Movement. Today's assembly is informed by three important issues. The first is a recognition in the Climate Justice Charter Movement that all the efforts we all have been making around climate politics in South Africa have not been enough. Our investments in fossil fuels are continuing, our emission rates are going up, and we haven't really been able to mainstream the climate emergency. And in that context, we developed over two conferences a set of strategic perspectives to mainstream the climate emergency in South Africa. Today, we'll be elaborating on strategy 2 related to a climate emergency social contract for South Africa, as well as a climate emergency state. That's one of the big strategies that we've decided to work with. The other is, of course, building an international bloc of vulnerable countries, peoples, movements, and so on. The third, of course, is deepening our democracy, so we have deep, just transitions from below. And the fourth is building an anti-party movement that is transformative. So that's the first sort of consideration informing today's deliberation. The second consideration is that 1 billion people are going to elections this year on our planet. Many have already gone to elections. We've had our own national election. And as part of our strategic approach to break through the mainstream and place the climate emergency on the ballot, we attempted an electoral campaign. It was really a long shot. We were not formally sort of organized since October last year. We had a core activist base, over 286 endorsing organizations for the charter, but we were not fully organized with the machinery, a proper movement. But nonetheless, we tested the idea, and the thrust of what we were trying to do was, again, to build a narrative around the electoral moment, place the climate emergency centrally into mainstream democratic politics, etc. So with all the limits and all the constraints, of course, we failed, but we're not going to stop there. We want to take this strategy 2 around the climate emergency social contract into public discourse, which brings me to the third point, that we are now in a second transition of our democracy away from one-party dominance. We all can see that the political field has shifted and changed dramatically. It's all about power sharing. It's all about governments being constituted and working together from different political parties. Of course, the ANC has chosen a government of national unity. Our argument today is that this government of national unity has to take the climate emergency very, very seriously. As part of the larger poly crisis, we see the climate emergency as an entry point to address the state dysfunction, to address the inequalities of our society, the hunger in our society, the unemployment in our society. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Awande Buthelezi to present and walk us through the climate emergency social contract document that we've developed. We've invited you all here to give us further feedback before we release this into a public process. This is a time-sensitive process, as you know. Things are happening quickly, but we want to be able, again, to position our narrative and this idea into the public discourse. Thereafter, after his presentation, we will get feedback from you, and then, of course, we'll have a way forward. So it's a very focused meeting, and if we manage time carefully, it shouldn't take us too long. Awande, are you ready?
Hi, yes. Let me just begin sharing my screen. So that should be clear for everyone?
Yes, can see it.
Okay, thank you. So today I'll be presenting on the climate emergency social contract document, which we've sent out with the meeting invitation for everyone. I hope everyone has gone through it or read it or touched on it. But today I'm just going to walk everyone through it for the purposes of this meeting so that we can have a focused discussion on what we are proposing and putting forward to everyone. So the document is broken up into 5 sections. I'll just run through every section because obviously they build on top of each other from the introduction all the way through to the way forward. And this will obviously inform the discussion that we will have after this. So with the beginning, the document begins with some context. We realize now coming out of this election moment that it is clear for all of us to see, particularly when looking at the national discourse, that all the parties that contested in our elections this year did not really take the urgency and the need of grasping what is coming with the worsening climate crisis seriously. It was not necessarily included in the election discourse. As Vish was speaking about right now, as a movement, we sought the election or the electoral tactic rather as a means of mainstreaming and putting center the climate emergency. And it is clear that without um, that kind of movement thrust that we were trying to bring, that climate was very much at the bottom of the rankings. And it's also clear now coming out of the election that it is something which is missing even within the current discussions around the government of national unity. It is omitted from their statement of intent, but it's also omitted in the general discourse around what are the parameters of this government of national unity, what should they be, what are the points that should be looked at with regards to the economy and inequality and the vast array of issues that our country faces. But climate is something which is not brought up in these discussions. It is clear for us within this space that the climate crisis, impacts us more than others, particularly because we are a climate hotspot. That is part of why this framing of a climate emergency is necessary, so that we must contend with where we will be when the world overshoots. Different studies base it between 2028 and 2034. So it's something that is around the corner, and our country is shockingly unprepared to face these consequences. We saw the extreme weather events that occurred the week following the national elections. So in and around all of this, it is clear that we're still facing and living within the reality of the climate crisis, whether our political space is trying to contend with it or not. The rising costs of the climate shocks and compounding our ballooning public debts and our failure for our country to put itself on a climate emergency footing means that there are also other economic ramifications that we face as a country with regards to our inability to face the climate crisis. So this document puts forward a case for a climate emergency social contract. It's a overarching framework that we're proposing for South Africa's government of national unity to work within and to work in partnership with civil society, and also for it to be driven by workers and people from below. So this comes out of the framing that was put forward in the Climate Justice Charter, and the Climate Justice Charter movement's call for a climate justice deal to address our country's polycrisis of unemployment, hunger, inequality, and the weakening criminalized market democracy, amongst the other issues of the ecological crisis. So that's what the introduction sets forward in terms of the context in which this call for a climate emergency social contract is being put forward. So then we begin with this understanding and concept of the social contract and why it matters and the need for it within this space that we're in currently right now. After the end of the apartheid regime, with the beginning of our democratic dispensation, South Africa did have a social contract of sorts within its formative years. We entered into this democracy with an understanding of that importance and what we need to agree around as a social contract for this new democracy. It was underpinned by a number of values, which I'm going to list, or is listed in greater length in the document. But these values and these points were undermined by the corruption we've seen in the past 30 years, the pro-market leaning that our government has taken, and the failed leadership that has continued to get worse and worse and compounded the issues which we had to face historically. in the creation of this democracy. So the RDP, Reconstruction and Development Program, was meant to be a people and worker-led program, is what the ANC government entered into power with, promising on the back of that election that they would implement it. It was further downscaled and then eventually swept aside for gear. A transformative constitution, which was put into place following the achievements of our democratic dispensation. And within this new constitution, we'd built into it an implicit agreement that people needed to create a new society that was based on universal suffrage, equality, inclusivity, and democracy, that it must benefit everyone. And it was built off of the back of the Freedom Charter, and it took into serious consideration the path that we were coming for, and that informed this new world, or this new society rather, that we were trying to build. There was also a commitment to reconciliation that was baked into this early period. And it was also based on a disclosure about harms, as we saw in the TRC commissions. It was informed by principles of non-racialism and inclusive nation building. And some of it was watered down into the rainbowism, which people speak about disparagingly. But if you go back and take into serious consideration what was supposed to be built at that time, it was based on serious principles of non-racialism to heal the deep wounds that our past had left us with as a country. But as I said, in the 3 decades of the ANC's uncontested rule of this country, this had been undermined. These points have been compromised and pushed aside, and the promise of this post-apartheid social contract has fallen apart. What we have now instead is a deeply polarized society. It is deeply precarious, and it's at a very dangerous moment right now, as you see the rise of exclusionary nationalism, anti-democratic, anti-constitutional parties coming to the fore, and rising and entering into our parliament following these election results that we've just seen. So from the perspective of the Climate Justice Charter movement, addressing this climate crisis together as society requires us to deal with the legacies of apartheid. We cannot run from them, but we must face them head on. We must also face the current poly crisis and its reality in seriousness. And this requires for us to work in solidarity to secure a livable and just democratic future. So the document puts that forward also, and also further states and makes clear that as a movement, what we're bringing forward is the plurivision that is contained in the Charter, which seeks to put forward how we deal with this crisis by showing that society must own its problem together. And we further reinforce that in this call for a climate emergency social contract. So now, following this context of the failure of this post-apartheid social contract and its need as set out, we then look at this current moment, how the government of national unity plans for an all-inclusive national dialogue. If you followed the presentation today by the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, the proposals made by former President Thabo Mbeki in the weeks following our election as this GNU was taking form, but also if you had followed his speech from earlier on in the year, it is clear that within the space of the ruling elite, there has been some kind of understanding or shift towards a feeling that we require a national dialogue of sorts. The president himself also alluded to this in his inauguration speech also. So it seems that it is something which we will see following this moment of this GNU being fully constituted. And the reasons that they put forward is that it is necessary for us to be able to deal with the moment and where the country is. But as it currently stands, and what is being proposed is one which is based on building and strengthening a NDP plan. That's what the president's proposing, why he's proposing, rather, sorry, a national dialogue for us to strengthen and build an NDP that has already failed to meet all of its targets. So it is safe to say that this will not work, and it will not allow us to address the root causes of the desperation that our country, is currently facing. So what it will do in stalling us being able to take this decisive action is further feed the growth and the appeal of this rising new extreme right wing in our country's politics. The Climate Justice Charter, though, the Climate Justice Charter movement has not been opposed to a national dialogue, though. We have called for it in a number of times, a Codesa 2 of sorts, to build a national consensus around this worsening climate crisis, which we seek to confront. We want to build a united and transformative front against it. So it's not a dialogue for dialogue's sake or to build on the current consensus as our current government is seeking to do, but it is one to create a new structure and transformative structure framework, for us to tackle the climate crisis. So it goes without saying that the Climate Justice Charter movement does not agree with former President Thabo Mbeki's approach to Convention for Democratic Renewal. This approach and framing that he put forward, particularly if you listen to his speech, but if you'd read the statements that they put out when they're speaking about how they want to constitute this national dialogue, it fails to recognize the poly crisis. It fails to recognize the interconnectivity of the systemic crises that have created this poly crisis. It does not really take into account how inequality, hunger, biodiversity loss, structural employment, criminalized market democracy, and the worsening climate shocks interact and work around each other to compound the crisis that this country is facing currently. And that we have to address these things simultaneously. I think that is a starting point that we can all agree on, is that we cannot tackle these things in bit part. And the framing and the approach that has hit the mainstream is one of a static approach in first trying to address and understand what are we facing, and then seeing some kind of way of how do we approach it sequentially. But I think it's fair to say in that the systemic thinking of our climate justice activism and of the way in which the climate crisis is opening it up and impacting us, we understand that this is something which requires systemic and simultaneous action. This is a starting point on which we disagree with the way in which this call for a national dialogue is being framed. In addition to that, the Climate Justice Charter movement does support an inclusive national dialogue approach, as suggested by some of the parties that make up this incoming GNU. But this dialogue has to break new ground. It cannot be something that is led as a box-ticking exercise for these GNU parties, but it has to be something which can help Parliament to achieve a climate emergency social contract convention, which would be driven from below. And the document goes further into expanding on this point. But just to touch on what we can also bring into our conversation, what are some of these processes that we believe the dialogue should entail and have within it, is we need to see process and participation. So that means an inclusive convening of a committee that will form this dialogue. So obviously the GNU parties would be part of that. Parties in Parliament that are willing to support such a process would be part of that. Civil society has to be central in this. Representatives from communities have to be given space in this, particularly those that are impacted by climate shocks and other injustices. They must be who establishes this convention and this process. And obviously it must be supported and funded by Parliament as a national process. We need to see mass communication. And that's part of what we've lost as a nation in this period of decay that our country has faced in the past 30 years. We saw it in the time of the HIV/AIDS crisis and some of the education that was happening around that. As a young person, I remember how things that you wouldn't learn at school or at home were part of the mass communication that the government put forward to educate the citizenry and everyone around that crisis. And we need something of that scale and beyond for this process. The media needs to be an integral partner in this process, pushing forward access to these deliberations, sharing information widely and constantly with the public so people can be really tapped into what is happening at all times and how these discussions are taking place. So that means that the public, communities and workplaces have to be invited to make submissions at these convenings, and they have to be given the space to deliberate over the contents of the climate emergency social contract. The convention obviously has to be televised. We have new media platforms now, social media and other ways of accessing and spreading information, and that must be utilized to its fullest capacity to share this information and to help bring about and solicit the responses from the public to be included within this process. We need a panel of experts on the party crisis to be given space within this process. So that requires us to see climate scientists being brought in, ecologists, social development experts, heterodox economists. All of them must be invited and given the space to make submissions on the poly crisis facing our country so that we have all the necessary information and all the necessary inputs to really bring these to the fore when discussing and framing this climate emergency social contract. The agenda setting and how it needs to take place must be based on submissions from the public. That is the thrust and the foundation of how we structure this. Experts as well, as I said, would have their space from parties, but also from civil society to define this agenda and to help us achieve this climate emergency social contract. Public dialogues on the outcome of the document would require for us to see a draft framework coming out of the sitting. It should be circulated and it should be taken around the country. It should be taken to rural communities, township communities, urban communities, across provinces, cities and towns, to mining affected communities, to coastal communities, to all these places. This information must be brought to them. This framework should be brought to them. It should be something that is implicit and ambient across the entire societal spectrum in terms of how it is understood and the way in which it's communicated so that people can understand and have their ability to make their inputs for the final submission. In the same way as some of us would remember, or those who are older, but I remember as a child in the terms of the new South Africa when the Constitution was being brought in, the way in which copies of the Constitution were so prevalent and accessible everywhere, and that information around people's rights and the new Bill of Rights and the new changes that were being brought into democracy were prevalent and spread out anyway. We need that, but we need that en masse ramped up for this draft framework. And then finally, with regards to the national referendum, what we need to see is that this final climate emergency social contract must also be subjected to a national referendum to allow us to be able to complete this process holistically to then take it to Parliament for further implementation. So then the co-management of that consensus will obviously be under the control of Parliament, and this Convention for a Climate Emergency Social Contract should meet twice regularly following this to make sure that progress is assessed and that these processes are being implemented in the way that they need to do. So the document expands further on all these points as it lays them out, going into detail in terms of how we can see that and how these things can be put into place. The convention process also should be limited to 3 months. It can't be something that is extended and allowed to, go on without end, because we are dealing with urgency and the time limits of, this overshoot that we are bound to face, particularly as a climate hotspot region. So the GNU then, as it is inaugurated, can be guided by this framework and develop it in a way in which this climate emergency social contract can protect the firm consensus that will help, rule this country for the next cycle, but also for the next decades as we continue to face these climate harms. So what is the CJCM's approach to a climate emergency social contract? The document has gone through its introduction. We've spoken about the need for a social contract. We've spoken about the way in which we should inaugurate it within this moment. But what are some of the other attributes in which the Climate Justice Charter movement is proposing a climate emergency social contract should look like? So obviously that begins by the fact that it is guided by the Charter's call to break with business as usual thinking. So that means taking into consideration the accelerating rate at which the crisis is exacerbating our poly crisis, and the way in which we believe that this climate emergency social contract should be premised by the main objectives of our country being a hotspot that is going to overshoot 1.5 degrees as we're looking at the 3 degrees warming scenario as a starting point if we do not tackle the climate crisis. So that means that the primary objective, obviously, is to accelerate the deep just transition across communities, workplace sectors, and that this should lead a process from the state and below of transformative decarbonization, adaptation, and regeneration. But in addition to this, what we need to see in a climate emergency social contract is that it ensures climate justice systemic transformation. So that means it has to address other systemic polycrises. We cannot pick and choose. All of these must be apparent and must be clear at the fore of this climate emergency social contract. And the final of these main objectives that we need to see is the clear agenda that sets about democratic systemic reforms. So these democratic systemic reforms must be and should clearly be seen to anchor the process from below. So these are non-negotiable in what we can see as a proper climate emergency social contract. So it's not a name for a name's sake, but it has to be imbued with these characteristics. And this is the measuring stick along which we will be able to distinguish whether it is a watered down process or one which would meet the needs and the criteria of what the moment demands of us. So the document sets that clear, and this is also something that can help us in our deliberations and guide us in our conversation. So the current macroeconomic thinking, which has caused the crisis, deep globalization, resource extraction, deindustrialization that we've seen, the transactional BEE, all of it will seek to find a space within this process. It has not worked, and it has created and helped facilitate this criminalized rent-seeking politics. But this is what the structure of business as usual looks like. And what we're seeing right now as the just transition discourse has reached the mainstream and the process has already been taken up by a structure such as the Presidential Climate Commission is that once the space for business as usual thinking has entered into the space, what we will see and what we're seeing is the facilitation of an unjust transition. So we need new conceptual ideas. We need alternatives, as we see in the charter's plurivision. We need all of these things to help us create a life and ecocentric reorganization of the economy. These things are non-negotiable. So these are fundamental aspects of what the climate justice charter movement sees as being necessary in the framing and construction of a climate emergency social contract. What we need to see also is space for democratic planning for life enabling common systems. So we need to see our natural commons being taken into serious consideration in terms of how we expand the health, but access to these natural commons, water, land, biodiversity, but also public commons infrastructure. So healthcare, education, public transportation, and culture also must all be given a space for expansion within this framework. Our real wealth needs to be put to the fore. Society has to be able to plan bottom up to ensure resilience, to ensure that these structures adjust, to ensure that they're restorative and regenerative also. So these are all very clear principles that cannot be moved away from in what is a climate emergency social contract. But finally, also, we need to see the systemic alternatives being put to the fore because they are the driving thrust of these democratic systemic reforms. These are what would allow us to achieve transformative decarbonization, adaptation, and regeneration. The Climate Justice Charter movement has been working on the 14 14 climate emergency policies that come from the 14 systemic alternatives that we see in the Charter. So examples that I'll put forward, for example, also which are expanded on in the document are food sovereignty to end hunger and to prevent climate famine, which promotes democratically planned triple transition of commercial, small-scale, and coastal food systems into food sovereignty common systems, eco-mobility policies, which promotes pedestrianization, help us achieve mass clean energy public transport systems, encourage things such as cycling, which needs to be democratically planned to decarbonize transport systems, bringing in taxi owners to help share in solving this problem of mass public transport systems, finding ways to also create systems for cooperatives or democratic public utilities to help build in and provide jobs for people within these policies. And universal basic income grants, of course, is a non-starter, one that is not means tested and one which is not calibrated to be a non-debt financed and a complement to the existing grant system. So one which can be gradually consolidated into a single system, which increases and expands through greater wealth and corporate tax increases. This is very important for a deep just transition, and it's one which cannot not be included in this framework. And then, of course, carbon eco-wealth and inheritance tax. These are fundamental, particularly in the South African context. These drive to the restorative aspects of what this climate emergency social contract requires. This cannot be negotiated on. So finally, to finish this off with the way forward for the climate justice charter movement and some things to consider for our discussion also is that we will campaign for this proposal in the following ways. To invite input from all the 286 organizations that have endorsed the charter, including this assembly, which we're having, but also further discussions with these organizations. So we've signed off on this document. This is what's happening right now. So we're launching an online petition process to garner support for this. After this, we will issue a press release with a demand for a climate emergency social contract, with a link to the document for the public also. We will publish articles, op-eds, and other processes. We'll meet with key actors to help build consensus and support for this, and also participate in a national dialogue if it is democratically constituted to put forward this perspective. I will end here.
Thanks, Awande. So, comrades, it's open for deliberation. We've received some wonderful feedback from different organizations that have endorsed the charter already. Lots of written comments, and most people agree with the thrust of this document. We haven't had anyone reject it or disagree, but it's open. Comrades, it's open for your input, engagement, comments, etc. Who would like to go? Please raise your hands. We can give you the platform. Anybody? Somebody's hand is up here. So for some reason I can't see everything. Janet, yes, Janet, go ahead.
Hello, hi, Vishwas, hi everybody. So I'm quite interested in this idea of a social contract, and my feeling is that it's actually a really good idea. And my question is how it relates to the national dialogue. So I think Awande ended by saying that if the national dialogue is constituted in such a way that it's inclusive and democratic and so on, then the social contract could contribute to the national dialogue. And I'm sort of wondering what the relationship is between the two things. So on the one hand, the social contract, as it's been outlined, is basically something that's being put forward by this coalition. And it's a parallel process, as it was with the Climate Justice Charter itself, where it's like a demand or a document, but it's sort of parallel to what's going on in government. And the alternative, or not the alternative, but a sort of related strategy would be to go into the national dialogue as a really major lobby from civil society, and say, like, we are the climate justice lobby who are within this national dialogue really pushing for some kind of a social contract around climate, around the climate emergency, which I think is would be a really powerful strategy. But I don't think the two things are the same. You see, I don't think you can formulate this social contract outside of that and then say, you know, this is then it's a symbolic thing, which is also fine, but it's a different thing. So if it's symbolic, you're saying we formulated the social contract, here it is, and you want it to go to a referendum. That's the one idea which is put forward. The other idea would be to say we want to participate as a big force within this national dialogue, and argue for a social contract around climate. Anyway, that's just my idea about it.
Sure. So I wonder, do you want to respond? I have some comments too. Do you want to engage with that?
Yeah, I'd make a quick response to say that I think that point is well met. I personally been doing a lot of thinking and listening around how people outside of the GNU and in the general public think about the need for a national dialogue. And my two thoughts or concerns around it is, as I was saying before, and that the way in which it's been framed by the president is that it's a national dialogue to help the government achieve the NDP. And I think that would be very limiting, and that I think that contradicts what we're trying to put forward with the climate emergency social contract. We're trying to move away from business as usual thinking and to contribute to a dialogue that only wants to further bolster an NDP that's already failed. Would be the heights of maintaining business as usual. So that's just one of my concerns, is that framing and the way in which we as non-governmental actors, civil society, as activists, as communities, and as workers are brought into the process also requires some kind of space for us then to be able to bring to the agenda something like this, where it has to be said, like, NDP has failed. It's not working. We want to think broader. We're thinking differently. So that's my only concern around that. But I do take your points well in terms of being in the process to put this forward as a force, as a group. Yeah, because at the end of the day, what we want to do is affect the change that puts us on the right footing as a country to meet the climate crisis. But those are my only concerns in terms of these things shouldn't be captured and diluted for a process which is not fit to meet our requirements.
I can just add to what Awande says. I mean, one of the things we've been reading in the moment is the political field. And if you look at the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, and they raised their voice around this just before the elections, and they've continued to kind of amplify this thing. There's a strong process-centered thrust in their thinking around how things should be put together. And it's really centered around NEDLAC, and there's a very tight, streamlined process that they envisage, typical technocratic Mbeki style, which will be very disempowering. It will be an invited space, choreographed, and of course, it'll have some predetermined outcomes. It'll be loaded in that kind of way. Of course, we understand urgency. Of course, we understand we need to get this government working and moving, etc. The problems are there as well. But I think for us, the process is as important as the outcome. And so this document that has been put together and endorsed through our NCC is about saying, yes, we want to have a place in this process, but we also want to be able to speak to process issues so that there's a genuine dialogue. And of course, put forward a set of proposals, test them in debate as well on how this thing is constituted. Parliament for us is very, very important. Under the ANC government, for decades, we've weakened our parliament. It doesn't mean if MK is there or if EFF is there, etc., we still ignore our parliament, because that seems to be the considerations right now. No, our parliament must be strengthened in this process. And I think that's where we are coming from in terms of process. The parliament has to co-create this climate emergency social contract with civil society and all of us. And so from the word go, we'd like Parliament to play a pivotal role. And yes, if there are parties like MK and others who are just not interested in it, we leave them behind and we go forward with our Parliament as society. So yes, the process is important, and for us to have a position on that, and of course to have a position on substantive outcome, and to take that into this process. So yes, Janet, we want to be there. We want to engage. We want to go in. But yes, we also want to hear from everyone else too, before we take the leap. Janet, your hand is still up. Is that an old hand? Is there anyone else wants to share thoughts? Anybody? Jane, go ahead. Quinn?
Hi, thanks. Actually, it's sort of coming from a different side, from a process side. I'm just battling to kind of participate in the conversation when I don't know who else I'm in the room with. It just makes it a little bit more dissociated. And I don't know if it's the way that, I don't think it's me, the way I'm seeing this, but I don't know if it's the way that the webinar is set up and if that's on purpose. I just wanted to kind of raise that because how we talk to each other in these spaces makes a bit of a difference. Thanks.
What would you prefer, Jane? I mean, I don't know. I mean, we're just trying to use this technology as best as we can. We're not rolling in money. We're just trying to get.
It might be me. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I'm only seeing your screen. I'm not seeing everybody's, and so I don't know who else. Normally, often we see everybody else who's in a room.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm chairing. That's why I put mine on. I haven't asked people not to put theirs on. Please, yeah, put on your whatever you need to be transparent.
Okay, it must be my settings. Don't worry. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Yeah, comrades, please feel free to put up your hands, put your video on. We want to see you. We want to engage with you. Are there other hands that are up? Am I missing this? Other hands?
Sorry, Vish. I think it's that others don't have speaking function, so we need the host to give them speaking function. Then
who's
they
controlling
can put their
that?
cameras on and such.
Yeah. Who's dealing with all of that?
I think Charles is doing it now.
Okay, Sean Faulty, then Nosintu. Sean, you have the floor. Please go ahead, put your video on or whatever. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah, I agree. I have read through the document. I agree with the points, good points. My only concern is that the ruling class has many ways to ignore what the people want. Even if a large number of organizations want this, they have many ways of ignoring it. How are you going to get past that? Or, they can stretch it out for years. They can water it down. They can blame people for being too demanding. So how do you plan to put pressure on the ruling class to adopt these sort of this proposal?
Right. That's a great question. I wonder, you have any thoughts on this? And anyone else too, this is a debate. We're trying to clarify what we're doing here. This is a good question. I wonder. And I'm noting the point. Sorry, Amanda, before you come in, I'm just noting the points about how this has been set up. And, to be honest, I have no clue about how these platforms work. So going forward, Charles and Wande and others, there's something here about setting up things as meetings and other things here, webinar. So I think, yeah, we have set it up as a webinar, not a meeting. That is why people cannot see who else is in the room. It means next time we may have to set it up as a meeting. Okay, the point is taken and we agree. We will do this differently the next time. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. Sorry, Wande, go ahead.
Oh no, I was saying that I was trying to work on giving everyone speaking function so that they could see each other.
Yeah.
I think that the point that Sean makes is part of what needs to be brought up in this discussion before we can say this is a great idea, let's just enter into a national dialogue, which is set, because that's part of what Vish is saying now about, process matters as much as outcome, is that we don't want co-option, we don't want dilution. But the first part of that also is that in these kind of initial kind of discussions and framing, it's important that those things are ironed out and not compromised on, in the sense that we can collectively agree on these principles and then hold collectively on that if we enter into such a space where the ruling class and those with their interests against climate justice objectives such as this do not then fracture and pick apart the process. So it's, for example, like how the concept of a just transition within spaces such as the Presidential Climate Commission can be used as a fig leaf to cover up the inclusion and the delaying of those with interest in the fossil fuel economy from actually needing to take restorative action because they can hide under being part of the process of a just transition. So I think language, for one, is clear. And that's why in this discussion and the points we're making around process versus outcome are very important, because those are the kind of foundational tenets across which we can then build something that is strong and cohesive enough to not be co-opted.
I'll just add two other points to what Awande said. I mean, and the first is climate impacts and determinism and climate risks. You see, the Presidential Climate Commission is so disingenuous in this country. It has not modeled the risk of a 1.5 degrees Celsius overshoot, because it has bought the line of a 2050 transition, okay? It's marching in step with a very flawed multilateral consensus, a dangerous multilateral consensus. But it's using that, of course, and it's used it effectively to give leeway to this carbon-based economy, the Montashas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that Presidential Climate Commission is setting us all up to walk into a nightmare, okay? And that is why climate determinism and its impacts, sadly, the Tongaat disaster we just had, the next drought that's coming, the next heat wave that's coming, et cetera, that's going to keep these ideas alive, comrades. And that is why seeding them is very, very important. Constructing a narrative around them is imperative. Placing them in the national debate and dialogue is absolutely necessary. But there's a second thing. Our politics is not top-down. So, you know, our third strategy is deep democracy to accelerate the deep just transition in communities, villages, towns, and cities. So we're doing that. We're doing that with our food work. We're doing that with our water work. And there's so much more to do there. And I think this is where our movement building approach is going to be very, very important, where all of us here are engaged in driving this just transition wherever we live, wherever we work. And all of this will add up. We'll build critical mass around this. This is the terrain we have to master as climate justice activists. We got to start building the social contract in communities. We got to start building it in workplaces. And if we build critical mass there, they can't ignore it. Nosintu, you had your hand up.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm glad to be in this space. I got a chance to be. My concern, I'm sure is the ground concern, is actually this GNU and changing of cabinets and stuff like that. Something that is still in the cocoon. And what we are concerned is that the climate crisis is actually now it's burning up, and I'm concerned about the leadership that is coming in with this GNU, because these political minds that is going to be there are in different thinkings, especially about climate, and they are very in denial, and no one is talking about it. And my concern is that for climate crisis to actually, what we built already is going now to pause. My concern is that because it seems as if it's going to take another 5 years for this GNU and things to accelerate, to actually lifting up on the ground. So my concern is this GNU and these people that are going to be there, that are going to set things back for us that are already built this beautiful thing of fighting climate crisis, especially on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Nosintu. Awande, do you want to respond?
No point, but I'm seeing some other ones coming in the chat also that we haven't touched yet.
Yeah, I'll bring them in. You can just go ahead with responding to Nosintu or any of these comments. So there's a comment from Faisal around poverty alleviation linked to climate justice needs a strong linkage. I think, yeah, you can speak to that. And then Jane asks, my question is, how are we, those of us here, planning to do this first step of the CJCM will campaign for this proposal, for invite input, This to happen 1 week from the okay. Well, that's what we are in, Jane. I agree with the one that we need to view this as a process, not all-inclusive silver bullet, and therefore get this document accepted and agreed upon before enforcing compliance. That can be the next phase of this journey. I understand that we are here now beginning this process. I'm just wondering if there are other ideas about how we all pick up and work with this policy doc. Is it a draft? Okay, Awande, do you want to respond?
So we've sent it out to everyone, to the public, and also those in this meeting. What we're hoping, and part of the process of this conversation also, is to get inputs from others, but also for others to send us inputs so that we can strengthen and expand on this document. Also, it's not a very long document, but it is the basis on which we're thinking around what a climate emergency social contract should be once brought into that process of conversation and negotiation, and what it should be built on. So a lot of the other points, for example, like what Faisal said about poverty alleviation, and those points, also part of why we're talking about the poly crisis, and we're talking about these principles that cannot be deviated from. But obviously some of those things can be strengthened in inputs that others can make once they've gone through the document, and seeing how we expand on those points. It's also something which is working on another leg with regards to some of the other policy work which we've done as a movement, which informs and expands on some of those points. Concepts like the democratic systemic reforms, for example, come through in the policy thrusts that each of those alternative policies have been working on. So, for example, with regards to energy and things of that nature, concepts of the commons and expanding those also. So there obviously there's more, and there's greater work also that is being done outside of this to supplement the strength of what proposal of a climate emergency social contract can be put forward. So just to take that into consideration also with some of the points that are expanded on in the document that I didn't go deeply into in the presentation. But that's some of it is also on the CJCM site if you're looking for further understanding and expansion on some of the work around that. But also you can reach out to us and email to find out more in terms of some of the ones that are still in the process of being drafted and coming out. So for this process, we're in the consultative stage right now, and this is the purposes of such a gathering right now, to bring members of the movement together around thinking how we can expand and strengthen this for that kind of public interaction with the states and other stakeholders that they'll be bringing together for their own dialogue processes, because we need this to be on the table. We need a climate emergency social contract to be put forward.
Yeah. So before I bring in others, I mean, just to reinforce what Awande said, there's a lot of work that's been done actually around a climate justice deal for South Africa for 3 years. We've been engaging with heterodox economists. We've been doing some modeling of policies, et cetera, et cetera. And we are at a point where later this year or even early next year, we could surface the kind of scaffolding for new thinking around a climate emergency social contract, together with our climate emergency policy platform. So there's 2 pieces of work: translating the 14 alternatives of the charter into policies, as well as this idea of a climate justice deal, climate emergency social contract. That's been ongoing, as he said. So those things can, and they're available. This is part of building the movement. We've been constantly inviting people in to engage with that work. We've had so many webinars on different things, eco-mobility, food sovereignty. There's constant engagement around these frameworks, and we need activists to get involved in shaping that. And that relates to this process. This process is time sensitive, comrades. So we cannot have an open-ended thing here. We've got to be able to now move in tandem. And yes, I think today is one moment to open up debate. I think comrades need to go back and have further deliberation, but this can't be something that takes too long. We've got to tighten how we work. I think we must create platform for more feedback. The newsletter is there, so it'll be lovely to get views from different organizations on how they see this. It'll be lovely to get inputs from activists on the blog that we have. again, sending comments, sending feedback, etc. So we create an intellectual vibrancy around this thing. So it's not all worked out, but at least we have something for now to play the game and to engage. There's no fully worked out climate emergency social contract in this document. There is just some gestures kind of where and hinting of where we'd like to go. But that's the work we all have to do together, comrades. So I think what I'm saying is I'm agreeing with the one day, I'm agreeing with the sentiment in the meeting that let's keep it processual. But at the same time, let's also position ourselves to enter the national debate while at the same time strengthening our own internal processes of collective thinking, learning from each other, pulling things together, and so on. Okay, there was a point here about, Janet raised this, the idea of a social compact implies a compact between different social forces. And so who should be part of this compact? This is a very important question. So I wonder how, any thoughts on this? Or anyone else? Awande?
Sorry, I was on mute. I mean, from my side, I think that's part of the reason why we convened this platform, is that all of the organizations which, as the Climate Justice Charter movement, we've worked with and have endorsed the charter, are the first starting points in terms of the kinds of organizations and allies that we want to bring together as forces to not only frame the contract, but then move it forward. So the thing is, there are two kind of processes, thinking around your earlier input, Janet, about us framing and thinking around something like this, and then being in a space, in a room on which it enters into the national space, where there'll be the politicians, the parties, business, and all the other forces. So for us, and what at this point, my thinking personally around, and what I'm taking into account in terms of how we interact and thinking around this, is around climate justice forces. So that is civil society organizations, communities, workers, and people from below. I think before then, how we think around how other groups will interact with this, it's most important for me personally that we find consensus and we strengthen and cohere around what we can then be united around, as then when we meet those other forces. So it also goes back earlier to Sean's question about protecting against co-option also. So that's what I'm thinking, and it's also what Vish was saying now in terms of taking this back to your organizations, to your groupings, to discuss, to deliberate upon, and then to come back. So I think, yeah, that's what I'm thinking around in terms of, the compactness of it, and the social forces or forces that we're uniting around. It's climate justice forces. Some of them, and most of them, are represented in the space, but also in your work and in your organizations and in your communities and workplaces also, you make up the broader parts of that. Sorry, Vish, there were two hands also in the chat that I didn't want to lose.
Okay, I'll go to them. But just to add to this, that historically, people have thought about social contracts as sort of class compromises in society. And you have capital and the state and labor, and this is the triadic relationship that holds social contracts together. Now we have a very different context in which our class structure has been fundamentally transformed. Labor is very weak and fragmented, but still very, very important as an ally in this process. But we also have a whole process of exclusion, okay, that has gone on as well. So you have large parts of our society that don't have any standing in the so-called market democracy, etc. They're part of a precarious, if you like, social structure, invisible, voiceless, etc., etc. So there's so the one thing we must keep in mind is that this is going to be a social contract with a spectrum of forces that are outside, that are inside and outside society, okay? And that's very, very important for it to be non-elitist. I think the second thing we must keep in mind, and we've been debating this as we've worked on the climate justice deal over the past 3 years, etc., is that this is not something that stands up there. It's got to be, again, a process framework in itself. We didn't really state it explicitly in this short document, but the way a climate emergency social contract should come together, it should involve every community, because again, it comes back to those very serious processes around decarbonizing, building adaptive capabilities, regenerative capabilities, and so on. It should involve every workplace. It should involve every sector, and of course, the state. And so bottom up is very, very crucial as a principle to guide how we add content to this overarching framework. So, ideally what should come out of this process is an umbrella framework, a framework that ends up being like a mosaic that different communities can add to it, workplaces, sectors, etc., etc. And I think that would be very crucial for this to be driven from below. If it's just going to be some kind of static thing, and then of course it's the state that now goes and implements and manages relationships, well, we're never going to achieve the kind of shift we want. Sorry, right. So let's just see. There was one or two other hands up. Elizabeth, you had your hand up. Was there anyone else?
Yes, the other hand was Alex, but he just wrote
Alex,
a message
yes.
in the chat that he has to leave
Okay.
to another meeting.
Okay. We can okay.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you so much for today. I'm quite a new joiner to the movement. I'm very excited. I just want to commend, I really enjoy the systems thinking approach, and how we can solve multiple problems, with the same mindset. And I think as like someone who hasn't worked a lot in public policy, or maybe isn't so well versed in how these things happen, I'm very curious and I'm enjoying learning about the process, but I was wondering if maybe a helpful step would be creating an executive summary, or a sort of a layperson's version of what we're trying to do. I know that when we take it to Parliament, it has to be very structured and, very realistic and practical, but perhaps to get the public on our side, it would be helpful to create a sort of a catchy or a very summarized and, so I want to say hopeful and inspiring version of the contract that we could share on our social media platforms with our friends and family, and sort of get the word out there I've written down here almost in a dreamy sense, and this is the world we could have. Like, imagine it working like this. Imagine us solving our problems like this. Imagine us coming together, and how impactful that would be. So I just wanted to, again, I understand that I haven't been part of this movement very long, but I just thought maybe that could be a nice way we could engage the public and get people on board, just by inspiring a positive message as well, in ways that are easy to communicate and share. Thank you.
That's an excellent suggestion and idea. I wonder, any thoughts on that, or any of the other comments that have come through?
I'll start with Elizabeth's point, and then I'll go to some of the other comments I'm seeing in the chat. I think that's a great idea, and I think that's part of the what we need next, and the what next in terms of how we move forward in communicating this, because it's part of the aspect of process. I think not just outcome, is that it's important that we do put this idea forward in the public domain, in the sense of people need to be thinking around that level of a climate emergency social contract. So people in communities need to be thinking about, how I exist in the society, what is the agreement between me and the state and all these other social partners in terms of how they think around working with me or my role in dealing with this emergency, because that's what we're trying to expand, as people's consciousness in the sense of thinking around this issue at that level. So I think the work of the charter itself, and then the movement, but the charter itself, where it began, and its plurivision, was an entry point into that envisioning and that communication of this alternative society. And this is an expansion and a continuation of the work of the charter's plurivision in trying to draw that out. And I think that while the two are kind of growing out of each other, I think your point is very important, in the sense of that the social climate emergency social contract does allow us also another way of communicating that difference and communicating that alternative. And it's one that meets the current moments also of our country's political moment and where we're going for the next 5 years or so. But obviously, we're thinking beyond 5 years. We're thinking decades for the climate crisis. So there's some things that we've done in the past and how we've communicated the charter and some of the policies. And some of those, I think, can be expanded upon to find new avenues of being able to communicate the the message of this climate emergency social contract. So on our site, we've had some media tools that we've made available for people to download and to be able to share. So things like stickers, posters, banners, even posters on the alternatives that we have in the charter, the ones which the policies are being framed from. So community and socially owned renewable energy, got posters on that. So we can also work around thinking how to expand on some of those ideas for this to then elaborate further and expand how we communicate this idea. I just want to get to Sven's point also, sorry, Vish, before I pass to you. Sven said, could this not be proposed as a living document that can be adapted as our situation nationally, regionally, and globally changes? So I think that's a good point, and we have to think around that in line with what Vish was saying now about how do we measure that with the timing, though, also of how this process is going to unfold and how we find our ability to wedge ourselves within it so that we can then open the door for all the other climate justice forces to then be able to have their seats and say in being able to dictate how this thing should roll out. So I don't think anyone would disagree with that, because we also need that dynamism. It speaks to what Vish was saying about non-static, non-top-down linear approach. So we definitely do have to think about allowing for that kind of dynamism in that.
Excellent. Are there any other final points from anyone? It's a pity we didn't get Alex. I should have been more alert looking at the list. Does anyone else want to make a comment or input before we wrap up? This has been very valuable. Yes, Errol, please go ahead.
Good day,
Errol?
everybody. Yeah, good day. I'm fairly new as well, but Delwyn invited me to the space, so thank you very much. As I was listening, and I went through the document, and I saw that part that spoke about the carbon border adjustment that's going to kick in 2026, I think. And so my comment and question would be, excuse me. So now with the, I don't know, you know this about the decommissioning of Komati power station and how disastrous it was and how it failed. And now the recent extension of the three, I think it's Camden, Hendrina, and the three other coal power stations were supposed to be decommissioned, but they extended it to 2030. So with the carbon border coming before that, how will that affect, the people in those communities in Mpumalanga again? Because if one thing is going to, we are talking about, Awanda was talking about the just transition about earlier on. And, that element, is it going to be just if the GNU is not prioritizing that, but we have the carbon border adjustment coming in, then 2030, will this time be enough for them to skill the communities? Because here as grassroots organizations, we commended them at first to say if they extend the decommissioning of the power stations, or give people time to adjust, to be skilled to new jobs. But is that happening? Because they're not saying anything about it to say, let's prepare the workers for this 2030. Let's prepare the workers for 2026. When the carbon border adjustment happens, it means there will be shedding of jobs already. What's going to happen to the communities around? So Mpumalanga is going to also be pressed more further. So just to speak also, so I like this document as well, that we must also stress the just part of the just transition to say, if they already have the money, let's prioritize the workers. Let's see it happening as it is now, not wait until 2030 for them to extend further. And we have this classist system that you were saying, where others, the inequalities that we already have as a country, employment and poverty, will be exacerbated furthermore, So that's my comment and question, if you can comment on that. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I wonder very quickly, and then I'm going to wrap up.
Okay. No, Errol, I think that's Errol. That's a very important part, and I like the fact that you brought in the Komati example, because this is why when we're speaking about this climate emergency social contract and in its framing, we're not speaking about it in a void of just a concept, but we're trying to link it to the plurivision, because within that we have thinking, we have processes, and we have work that is happening continually, even outside of this, that is dealing directly with some of those questions. So why, when we have these kind of discussions and we're speaking more about the framing, we've spoken about the constituency of like who is the compact, who are the social forces, those things are important, um, because we require them to make sure that those alternatives and those policy perspectives can then be given the space to come out to make the impact that they need to make. So that's another thing in terms of why I'd emphasize it in the presentation. And you said when you read the document, and something that we will continue to try to bring out as a thrust is that that must not get lost in this process wherever it moves forward, because those policies are not abstract policies. They speak to real points and issues with regards to how the just transition is already unfolding and how it's unfolding unjustly. So there's also an aspect of this climate emergency social contract that needs to rein in on some of those things that have already taken place. We need to pull back so that we can then move into the right direction. So that's another reason why, just for emphasis on the policy points and some of these points around the democratic systemic reforms and those principles, is that they also have to act as guiding trackers or markers to help us bring back the way in which the transition has already unfolded unjustly, let alone dealing fundamentally with the poly crisis and the legacy of apartheid. So it's also because the scale of this issue can take us into so many different directions in terms of how we think around it and how people can get lost in it. So that's why our guiding point is the plurivision of the charter, and that this is being built from it. But as we bring other forces into it, and other partners and constituency groups and workers and communities into it, and we're taking those inputs, us as the Climate Justice Charter movement, we're just trying to make sure that those things and those points don't get lost, and that there are principles and perspectives that communities and people have already put into place that we need to use as guidance for that.
Excellent. Thank you, Wande. So comrades, on the way forward, the first thing to note is that our next meeting has to have a different format. So thank you for bringing that to our attention, and we will make sure it is more interactive, more open and flowing, and so on and so on. So we're on a learning curve together. So that's very important. Now, Lydia makes a very, very important point. She's been dropping this comment throughout this meeting about us working together, about us converging. Okay. Of course, nobody owns the climate challenge and problem, et cetera, et cetera. But if we agree that, the clock is ticking, we have to do way more than what we've been doing, and we have to be way more impactful, then we have to start converging and we have to start building bridges. It's time, comrades, to move beyond symbolic politics. Symbolic politics has not won. Okay. The other side has won. And we now really have to think at another level of doing things. And this is where strategic climate politics becomes absolutely crucial. This doesn't mean you don't do what you're doing. If you're doing what you're doing, do it. But at the same time, let's keep on reinforcing and supporting each other. It's not either or. And I think I want to register that. It's only in that way, breaking out of our silos, having those connections, can we have critical strategic mass, okay? And that's what we need. The other point that's very critical here is balancing time. So this is a very time-sensitive process. Already you can see this cabinet's going to be announced, and then of course there's going to be a whole lot of push around how it works, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got to find a footing in that process. And while at the same time, we've got to keep our own process internally dynamic, robust, inclusive, etc. And so that's a question of leadership and the role each one of us plays. Which brings me to the point that was made about this being a living document. I love that phrase. I think that's exactly, it captures the spirit of what this is and what we're trying to do. So we'll even include that in the brief reframing of this document, which means, comrades and friends, take it back, take it down to your organizations, have deliberations, send feedback. As I said, you can use the newsletter to say, Organization X, this is what we think should be thought through and added, etc. Send it for the blog. Let's publish this. Let's help each other think this through. It's not, we haven't figured it out. It's not clear cut. We've got to constantly debate, discuss, empower each other collectively. That's what's important. So let's treat this as a living document. And we'll state that emphatically. We will also kind of tweak it in a way that, I mean, there's not many substantive things that have come through, and we don't want this document to say everything, okay? There's hopefully going to be a moment where we can have very worked out positions, which we can take into substantive negotiations, debates, etc., etc. But as much as possible, we'll try and capture sentiment. I think the other very, very important point here is getting involved, okay? So the CJCM has 286 organizations that endorse the charter. We have over 200 members and growing. We now have provincial coordinators. We have a back end on our webpage. We're going to be making a call now for people to pay their membership fee because we've adopted a constitution to pay finance member fees, etc. We don't have resources. We can't do what we need to do. We want to get everybody engaged, comrades, with this process. Again, to collectively think through the policy work. And if you want to get involved in a working group, etc., let us know. We'll connect you into things. There's going to be a big policy workshop later this month, and so on and so on. So get involved. Let's start building the CJCM. And that's what's key here. Because, you know, even in terms of the fights that are going to unfold around this, it's going to come down to who's standing with us, what power do we have in society, and so on. So we don't activate this 286 members, we don't activate the membership and bring it together into a serious movement, a purposive, focused, strategic movement. Well, again, we're going to be tripping over ourselves and we're not going to really move very far. So that's where we are. We got to give it liftoff. We've got to give the CJCM rootedness, presence, and a mass dynamic to it. And then finally, comrades, on the way forward in this document, I mean, nobody's really brought it into contention. I mean, we've agreed this is a living document. It'll evolve. We will invite more debate, more discussion, but we've got to get into the political fray. So we will start actioning those things in the way forward document. And again, we're looking to all of you to play your part. We will message a press release. We will start crafting a petition, etc. Again, lining up social forces around this kind of concept, this kind of intervention, and hopefully snowballing it together. So thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you for your very valuable input, the questions, comments, engagements, all very, very welcome. Thank you. And let's keep on working together, comrades. There's a lot to do together. Thank you. Take care.